My cousin demanded that I give her my house as a wedding gift. My cousin, Rachel, announced her engagement to Brian at Thanksgiving dinner and immediately turned to me saying she knew what my wedding gift would be. I thought she meant the crystal vases I'd been collecting for family weddings, but she said no, I'd be giving them my house. Not helping with the down payment, not lending money, but giving them my actual house that I'd bought 2 years ago after saving for a decade. She said it out loud in front of 30 relatives like it was already decided. I laughed thinking it was a joke, but Rachel was serious. She said I was single with no kids, so I didn't really need a 3-bedroom house. While they were starting a family, and desiraba problema, she actually used the word deserved while sitting in my dining room eating the dinner I'd cooked. My Aunt Helen, Rachel's mom, nodded along, saying it was so generous of me to help the young couple get started. I said I wasn't giving anyone my house, and Rachel's face turned red. She said I was being selfish keeping a family home all to myself when I could easily go back to renting an apartment, like someone my age without children should be doing anyway. She actually said those words to me, a 31-year-old homeowner, while she was 26 and living in Brian's mom's basement. The whole family went quiet, but nobody defended me. My Uncle Tom said sharing was important in families. My own mother said I should consider it since I could afford another place eventually. My dad stayed silent, which was him agreeing without having to say it. Rachel spent the rest of dinner telling everyone about the renovations they'd make to my house, how they'd turn my office into a nursery, how they'd repaint everything because my color choices were too dark. She was planning my house like she already owned it. After dinner, Rachel pulled me aside and said she'd already told Brian's family that I was giving them a house as a wedding gift, so I couldn't back out now without making her look like a liar. She said his parents were so impressed that her family was generous enough to provide housing. She'd apparently been bragging for weeks about her rich cousin who owned property and was going to set them up for life. She said if I didn't follow through, Brian's family would think she came from trash who made false promises. I said that was her problem for lying, and she actually started crying, saying I was ruining her wedding before it even happened. For weeks after that, Rachel kept acting like the house was already hers. She'd bring Brian over without asking to measure rooms and plan furniture placement. She'd tell people we were doing a title transfer and just working out the paperwork. She had mail sent to my address claiming she was updating her information early. She even told the neighbors she'd be moving in after the wedding and asked them about the neighborhood association rules. Brian's family started contacting me about the house too. His mother called, thanking me for my generosity and asking about property taxes. His father sent me an email about transferring utilities and whether the roof had been recently replaced. They were all discussing my property like it was a done deal. Rachel had convinced everyone I'd agreed to this insane plan. The breaking point was when Rachel sent me a realtor she wanted me to use to handle the transfer. The realtor, Diana, called me confused because Rachel had said I wanted to gift my house, but hadn't provided any documentation proving I owned it or agreed to this. Diana said she needed to see the deed and my written consent before proceeding. That gave me an idea. I told Diana I'd bring everything to Rachel's wedding planning party that weekend. Rachel had invited both families to plan the wedding and discuss the house transfer. She'd made it a whole event at Brian's parents' house, catered and everything. I showed up with a folder looking official and Rachel practically glowed, thinking I'd brought the deed. Brian's parents thanked me repeatedly for giving their son such a head start in life. His grandmother hugged me, saying not many people were so generous. His siblings kept asking about spare bedrooms and whether the basement was finished. Rachel had clearly promised them all space in my house. When everyone was gathered, Rachel asked me to present the paperwork I pulled out the deed and showed it to Diana. Diana read it and looked confused. Requested reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Up from the deed. Diana Deed looked at me with a question in her eyes and said she didn't see any transfer documents or gift paperwork in the folder I'd brought. Rachel's smile froze on her face while Brian leaned forward to get a better look at what Diana was holding. I took the deed back from Diana and explained calmly that this was my property deed, showing sole ownership in my name with no co-owners, no pending transfers, and no indication that I'd ever agreed to gift this house to anyone. The room went completely silent except for someone's phone buzzing on the table. Brian's mother stopped mid-sip of her wine and set the glass down carefully. Rachel started shaking her head and saying that wasn't the right paperwork, that I must have brought the wrong folder, but her voice had gone high and thin. I pulled out my phone and showed Diana the text messages where Rachel had told me weeks ago that she'd already informed Brian's family about the house gift, and I couldn't back out now without making her look bad. Diana read the messages with her eyebrows going up higher with each line. Brian took my phone from Diana's hand and scrolled through the conversation himself while his father moved closer to read over his shoulder. I watched Brian's face change as he read. Rachel telling me that his parents were so impressed by my generosity and that she'd been bragging to them for weeks about her rich cousin. His jaw tightened when he got to the part where Rachel said his family would think she came from trash if I didn't follow through. Brian looked up at Rachel and asked her point blank when I had supposedly agreed to give them my house. Rachel stammered that it was at Thanksgiving dinner in front of everyone, but I interrupted to remind Brian that 30 relatives heard me clearly refuse at that dinner. My mother shifted in her seat and looked down at her hands. Rachel tried a different approach and said that even if I didn't explicitly promise the house, I'd implied I would help them, and she'd just been optimistic about what that help would look like. Brian's father cut in and said that Rachel had told him very specifically that I was transferring the deed as a wedding gift, not that I might help with the down payment or loan them money. She'd shown them pictures of my house and talked about which rooms they'd renovate first. Brian's grandmother spoke up in a quiet voice and said Rachel had promised her she could have the guest room when she visited because the house was going to be theirs free and clear. The hurt in her voice made Rachel start crying, but this time it looked different from her previous tears. This looked like panic. Brian stood up and asked Rachel to step outside with him, but she grabbed onto the table and refused to move. She said, if we could all just calm down and discuss this reasonably, we'd see that this was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. I asked her directly how it was a misunderstanding when she'd sent a realtor to my house, had mail forwarded to my address, told my neighbor she was moving in, and brought Brian over multiple times to measure rooms without my permission. Rachel's face went red, and she accused me of trying to humiliate her in front of Brian's family. My Aunt Helen finally spoke up and said that even if I hadn't made a formal promise, family was supposed to help family, and I was being cruel to embarrass Rachel like this. Uncle Tom nodded along, but he looked less certain than he had at Thanksgiving. Brian's mother set down her wine glass with enough force that it clinked against the table and said she wanted to understand the timeline of events. She asked Rachel directly when they'd first discussed the house situation. Rachel said it was right after the engagement that I'd been so excited for her and had mentioned wanting to help them get started in life. I shook my head and said that never happened, that the first time Rachel mentioned the house was at Thanksgiving when she announced in front of everyone that she knew what my gift would be. My dad's brother, who'd been quiet in the corner, cleared his throat and said he'd been at that Thanksgiving dinner and he remembered me very clearly saying no to giving up my house several Other relatives who were at the wedding planning party nodded in agreement. Rachel looked around the room with wild eyes and changed tactics again, saying that maybe she'd misread some signals. But that didn't change the fact that they needed help and I had the means to provide it. Brian finally lost his patience and told Rachel they were leaving immediately. She clung to his arm and begged him not to do this in front of everyone, to please just give her a chance to explain properly. He pulled his arm free and walked toward the door. Rachel turned to me with genuine desperation in her face and said that if I cared about her at all, I'd tell Brian this was all a mistake and we'd work something out. I looked at her and said I did care about her, which was why I'd cooked Thanksgiving dinner and collected crystal vases for her wedding. But I would never give up the house I'd spent 10 years saving to buy. I told her she'd created the situation by lying to everyone, and now she had to face the results of those lies. Brian's father stood up and said his family needed time to process what they just learned. His mother hugged me briefly and whispered an apology for the confusion. Brian's grandmother touched my arm as she passed and said she was sorry for any pressure I'd felt. They filed out of the room one by one, leaving Rachel standing there with tears running down her face and my Aunt Helen rushing over to comfort her. The days after that party were strange and quiet. I heard through my mother that Rachel had moved out of Brian's mother's basement and gone back to living with Helen and Tom. Apparently, Helen was telling everyone who would listen that Rachel was heartbroken and it was entirely my fault for being selfish with my property. My mother said Helen was conveniently forgetting that Rachel had lied to 2 entire families and tried to steal a house. I didn't hear from Rachel directly, but I got several angry texts from Helen saying I'd ruined her daughter's life and destroyed her chance at happiness. I blocked her number after the 5th message. 3 weeks after everything fell apart at the party, my mother called to tell me that Brian had officially ended the engagement. She said Rachel was devastated and staying in her old childhood bedroom, barely eating or leaving the house. I felt genuinely sad for Rachel going through that kind of heartbreak, because breakups are painful no matter what caused them, but I also knew the relationship had been built on lies she told, and it would have fallen apart eventually even without the house situation forcing everything into the open. A relationship that starts with one person deceiving the other person's entire family isn't going to last. My phone started ringing more often over the next week, with family members calling to talk about what had happened. My cousin Jacqueline called and said she'd been thinking about the whole situation and she was horrified by what Rachel had tried to do. She said she would never expect anyone to give up their home, and she was sorry for not speaking up sooner when other relatives were pressuring me. Her support meant more than I'd expected, because Jacqueline and I weren't particularly close, but having her validation helped me feel less alone in the family. Other relatives reached out too, some apologizing for staying silent at Thanksgiving and others admitting they'd been uncomfortable with the pressure campaign but hadn't known how to intervene. I started to feel like maybe I wasn't the family villain after all. I spent a Saturday afternoon changing all my locks because I didn't trust that Rachel would try something vindictive. Now that everything had collapsed, it felt paranoid while I was doing it, unscrewing the old deadbolts and installing new ones, but it also felt necessary. Rachel had already proven she had no respect for boundaries by having mail sent to my address and telling neighbors she was moving in. I couldn't risk her showing up with a key somehow or trying to establish residence at my property. I also called a security company and had them install cameras at my front door, back door, and garage. The installer asked if I'd had break-ins in the neighborhood, and I just said I wanted to feel safer. Watching the camera feeds on my phone that night, seeing my own front porch from multiple angles made me feel more secure even though it was sad that I needed security measures against my own cousin. My mother texted the next day asking if I wanted to meet for lunch. I almost said no because I was still hurt that she hadn't offended me at Thanksgiving, but something in her message made me think she wanted to actually talk about what happened. We met at a restaurant halfway between our houses and she looked nervous when I sat down. She ordered coffee and then immediately started apologizing before the server even walked away. She said she was genuinely sorry for not immediately defending me at Thanksgiving when Rachel made her announcement. She explained that she'd been so shocked by Rachel's audacity that she defaulted into peacekeeping mode, trying to smooth things over instead of standing up for what was right. She said she realized now that some situations don't call for peace. They call for clear boundaries, and she should have told Rachel right then that demanding someone's house was completely unacceptable. Hearing my mother admit that meant everything. She said she'd spent weeks thinking about her own conflict avoidance and how it had enabled Rachel's behavior to escalate because no one shut it down early. If she'd spoken up firmly at Thanksgiving, maybe Rachel wouldn't have felt empowered to keep lying and planning like the house was already hers. I accepted my mother's apology and told her I appreciated her recognizing what had gone wrong, but I also made it clear that going forward, I needed her to actively support me in family situations rather than staying neutral or trying to keep peace at my expense. She agreed immediately and said she understood that her silence had felt like abandonment. She admitted that her conflict avoidance had enabled Rachel's escalating behavior by not shutting it down early, and she promised to be more direct in the future about calling out inappropriate behavior, even when it made family gatherings uncomfortable. We talked for 2 hours over lunch, and I felt our relationship starting to heal. It wasn't completely fixed because trust takes time to rebuild, but it was a genuine start. She paid for lunch and hugged me in the parking lot, holding on longer than usual. A month after the party, I had to attend a family funeral for a distant relative I barely remembered. I dreaded going because I knew Rachel would be there, and I had no idea how she'd react to seeing me. When I walked into the funeral home, I spotted Rachel immediately sitting in the front row next to Helen. She was wearing black and staring straight ahead, not looking around at all. When I walked past to sign the guest book, she didn't even glance in my direction. Helen kept Rachel close to her side throughout the entire service and shot me hostile looks every time I moved. Uncle Tom was there, too, standing slightly apart from his wife and daughter, and when our eyes met, he actually nodded at me. It wasn't friendly, but it wasn't hostile either. It might have been grudging acknowledgement that things had gotten out of hand. After the service, during the reception at the church, my dad's brother pulled me aside near the coffee table. He said he'd been thinking about everything that happened, and he wanted me to know that he thought I'd handled the situation correctly. He said Rachel needed to face consequences for her manipulation and lying, and sometimes family members need to be held accountable even when it's uncomfortable. He admitted that several family members had been uncomfortable with the pressure campaign, but didn't speak up, and he regretted his own silence. Having him say that out loud, acknowledging that other people had seen how wrong it was but stayed quiet, made me feel validated in a way I hadn't expected. I started making more effort to rebuild relationships with family members who had either supported me during everything or had apologized. Since then, I called Jacqueline back and we had coffee. I accepted invitations from relatives who'd reached out. I was slowly creating a smaller circle of family who respected boundaries and could be trusted. At the same time, I had to accept that Helen, Tom, and Rachel would likely never forgive me for not enabling the house theft. Helen still wouldn't speak to me at family events. Tom was civil but distant. Rachel avoided me completely. It hurt because we'd been close when we were younger, but I recognized it was a necessary boundary for my own well-being. I couldn't have people in my life who thought it was acceptable to try to take my home through lies and manipulation. My mother mentioned during one of our phone calls that Helen was struggling financially, and that was partly why she'd been so invested in Rachel getting a house. She said it like that should make me understand or excuse what had happened. I felt a flash of sympathy because financial stress is genuinely hard, and I didn't want Helen to be suffering. But then I reminded myself that their financial problems didn't obligate me to sacrifice a decade of my savings and my home. Lots of people struggle with money without trying to steal houses from their relatives. Helen's financial situation might explain her desperation, but it didn't excuse her supporting Rachel's lies and manipulation. I told my mother that I felt bad about Helen's struggles, but it didn't change anything about what Rachel had tried to do or what I'd had to do to stop it. 2 months passed, and I found myself standing in the produce section of the grocery store, holding a bag of apples and trying to remember if I needed anything else. I turned toward the bread aisle and nearly walked straight into Brian. We both stopped short, and there was this awkward second where neither of us knew what to say. He looked different, thinner, maybe, or just tired in a way that made him seem older. He said hi first, and I said hi back. And then we just stood there with our shopping carts between us like some kind of barrier. He asked how I was doing, and I said fine, keeping my voice neutral because I wasn't sure where this conversation was going. He nodded and said he wanted to thank me again for being honest about everything, that it had been hard, but he was doing better now. He told me he was focusing on his own life and being more careful about who he trusted, and the way he said it made it clear he meant Rachel specifically. I told him I was glad he was okay, and I meant it because seeing him hurt at that party had been awful, even though none of it was my fault. We talked for maybe 3 more minutes about nothing important, the weather and traffic and how the grocery store had rearranged everything again, and then he said he should get going. We said goodbye and went our separate directions, and I felt the strange mix of relief and sadness that we'd managed a normal conversation. A week later, my mother called while I was making dinner and told me Rachel had gotten a job in another state. She said it like it was good news, like Rachel was moving up in the world, but I could hear the worry underneath. My mother explained that Rachel wanted a fresh start away from the family drama and the reminders of her broken engagement. I understood that impulse because starting over somewhere new can feel like hitting a reset button on your life. But I also thought Rachel was running from having to face what she'd done from the family members who now knew she'd lied, from the neighbors who'd seen her planning to move into a house that wasn't hers. My mother asked if I thought Rachel would be okay out there alone, and I said I didn't know. I wanted to say that Rachel had made her choices and now she had to live with them, but my mother sounded sad enough already. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen stirring pasta and thinking about how Rachel had tried to take everything from me and was now leaving everything behind instead. The next few family gatherings felt different with Rachel gone. There was less tension in the room, less worry that someone would say the wrong thing and start another fight. But Helen still wouldn't look at me when we were in the same space. At my cousin's graduation party, Helen stayed on the opposite side of the yard the entire time, talking to other relatives, but pointedly ignoring me whenever I came near. My mother mentioned later that Helen blamed me for Rachel moving so far away and being isolated from family. That frustrated me because Rachel had isolated herself through her own choices, through lying and manipulating and refusing to take responsibility. Helen acted like I'd personally driven Rachel out of state, when really Rachel had driven herself there to avoid facing what she'd done. My mother tried to play peacemaker, suggesting maybe time would help Helen see things differently, but I wasn't holding my breath. 3 weeks later, I went to a family birthday party for one of my younger cousins. The party was at a park with picnic tables and a playground, and I arrived early to help set up. As more relatives showed up, I noticed something strange. The people who'd pressured me about sharing my house, who'd said family should help each other, and I had more space than I needed, were suddenly very quiet around me. Nobody asked about my living situation or made comments about my 3 bedrooms. When someone brought up real estate prices, the conversation shifted quickly to something else. Uncle Tom was there, and he nodded at me politely, but didn't try to start any discussions about family obligations. My mother's sister, who'd said at Thanksgiving that young couples needed support, now talked to me about her garden instead. It felt like a small victory in establishing boundaries, like they'd finally understood that my house was mine and not up for family discussion. My dad started calling me more often after that, inviting me to dinners and family events with a deliberateness that felt intentional. At a cookout at his house, one of my aunts made a comment about the Rachel situation, something about how family feuds were so unfortunate. My dad cut her off immediately and said the situation was resolved and we weren't discussing it anymore. The aunt looked startled but nodded and changed the subject. Later, my dad pulled me aside near the grill and said he was making up for not speaking up at Thanksgiving, that he should have defended me immediately. I told him I appreciated his support now and that it helped me feel less isolated within the family. He squeezed my shoulder and said he was proud of how I'd handled everything, which made my throat tight because I'd wanted to hear that for months. 3 months after the confrontation at the wedding planning party, my mother invited me to lunch at a cafe near her office. We ordered sandwiches and she seemed nervous, fidgeting with her napkin and not quite meeting my eyes. Finally, she told me that Helen had admitted something to her privately. Helen had said that Rachel had always had problems with honesty and entitlement, that she'd hoped marriage would mature Rachel and teach her responsibility. My mother said Helen had been so invested in the engagement succeeding because she thought it was Rachel's chance to grow up, regardless of the methods Rachel used to get there. I sat back in my chair processing this information, realizing that Helen had known all along that Rachel had character issues but had chosen to enable them anyway. My mother said Helen thought a husband and house would fix Rachel, like external circumstances could change who someone was inside. Hearing that even Helen recognized Rachel's character problems made me feel validated in a way I hadn't expected. Someone who'd been completely on Rachel's side had admitted, at least privately, that Rachel had serious issues, but I was also frustrated that Helen still blamed me rather than holding Rachel accountable for her own behavior. I told my mother this over our sandwiches, and she nodded slowly, admitting that some people will always enable their children's bad behavior rather than face the discomfort of setting boundaries. She said Helen loved Rachel so much that she couldn't see how her constant excuses and protection had actually made Rachel worse. I understood loving your child, but there had to be a point where you stopped covering for them and made them face consequences. Helen had never reached that point with Rachel and probably never would. The stress of everything that had happened, the family betrayal, and the violation of my boundaries started catching up with me in ways I couldn't ignore. I wasn't sleeping well, and I felt anxious in my own house, constantly worried that Rachel would show up or that some other family member would try to pressure me. I finally called a therapist and started going to weekly sessions. The therapist, an older woman with gray hair and a calm voice, helped me understand that my guilt about Rachel's broken engagement was misplaced. She explained that I wasn't responsible for the consequences of Rachel's lies, that Rachel had created the entire situation, and I'd simply refused to be victimized by it. We talked about how I'd been carrying this weight of family disapproval and wondering if I'd done the right thing, when really I just protected myself from theft. The therapist said that was not only okay but necessary, that nobody should sacrifice their home and financial security to keep family peace. Through several more therapy sessions, I worked on accepting that some family relationships were permanently damaged, and that was okay. The therapist helped me see that not all relationships are worth preserving if they require me to accept being exploited or manipulated. She asked me what I would tell a friend in my situation if I would advise them to give up their house to avoid family tension. I said, of course not. That would be crazy. And she pointed out that I deserved the same consideration I give a friend. We talked about how choosing myself over family peace didn't make me selfish. It made me someone with healthy boundaries. I started to feel less guilty about Helen not speaking to me and Rachel moving away because those were consequences they created through their own actions, not punishments I'd inflicted. For months after everything exploded at the wedding planning party, I decided to host a small dinner party at my house. I invited my parents, my dad's brother, who told me I'd handled things correctly, my cousin who'd called to say she was horrified by Rachel's behavior, and a few other family members who'd either supported me during everything or apologized since then. I spent the afternoon cooking and setting my dining room table, the same table where Rachel had once announced I didn't need my house. When everyone arrived, the atmosphere was warm and relaxed in a way family gatherings hadn't been in months. We ate dinner and talked about normal things, work and hobbies and vacation plans, with nobody mentioning Rachel or the house situation. After dinner, my dad's brother raised his glass and said he was glad to be in a home where boundaries were respected, and everyone clinked glasses with him. It felt good to fill my home with people who respected my boundaries and celebrated my accomplishments rather than trying to take them from me, to reclaim the space as mine, surrounded by family who actually acted like family should. My mother showed up carrying a bottle of wine and a container of her famous potato salad, setting both on my kitchen counter before pulling me into a tight hug that lasted longer than usual. She'd been coming to more of my gatherings lately, making an effort to show support in ways she hadn't before. Everything happened with Rachel. When everyone sat down to eat, she stood up without me asking her to and cleared her throat to get everyone's attention. She told the whole group that she wanted them to know how proud she was of me for standing firm when family pressure tried to push me into giving up something I'd worked so hard for. Her voice got a little shaky when she said that watching me defend my boundaries had taught her something important about the difference between keeping peace and enabling harm. I felt my eyes getting wet because hearing my mother say those words out loud in front of other family members meant more than I could explain. She sat back down and squeezed my hand under the table, and I squeezed back both of us, understanding that our relationship had shifted into something stronger and more honest than it had been before. I heard through my cousin Jacqueline that Rachel had settled into her new city and found a job at a marketing firm that paid pretty well. Jacqueline said Rachel had made new friends and seemed to be building a life for herself away from all the family drama and the broken engagement. Part of me felt genuinely glad that she was doing okay, that she hadn't completely fallen apart after everything collapsed. I hoped she'd learn something from the whole disaster, that maybe being forced to face the consequences had pushed her to grow up and stop expecting the world to hand her things she hadn't earned. But I also knew I had no interest in rebuilding any kind of relationship with her, not after she tried to steal my house and manipulated 2 entire families to make it happen. Some people could come back from that kind of betrayal, but I wasn't one of them, and I was okay with that. Boundary. 5 months after the wedding planning party disaster, I got an email From Helen that showed up in my inbox on a random Tuesday morning. The subject line just said, "Thinking of you," which seemed careful and noncommittal. I opened it expecting either a full apology or another round of blame, but what I got was something in between. She wrote that the situation had been complicated and that she wished things had gone differently for everyone involved. She didn't say she was sorry for supporting Rachel's attempt to take my house, didn't acknowledge that what Rachel did was actually theft, didn't admit that she'd been wrong to pressure me, but the email felt like regret, even if it wasn't full accountability, like she knew things had gone badly, but couldn't quite bring herself to say whose fault that was. It was more than I'd expected from her, honestly, given how angry she'd been and how completely she'd cut me off after I exposed Rachel's lies. I read the email 3 times trying to figure out if there was a hidden message or a request buried in the careful language, but it seemed like it was just what it appeared to be, a small gesture from someone who couldn't quite apologize but wanted to crack open a door. I sat with the email for 2 days before responding, writing and deleting several drafts that ranged from warm to cold to completely ignoring it. I finally settled on something polite but distant, thanking her for reaching out and saying I appreciated her thinking of me. I didn't offer to get together for coffee or suggest we try to rebuild what had broken between us. I kept my response short and cordial, the kind of thing you'd send to someone you used to know but didn't really want back in your. Some relationships could exist in a civil but distant state, and that felt appropriate for me and Helen, given that she'd never fully acknowledged that her daughter had tried to steal my house through lies and manipulation. I could be polite without being close, could respond without opening myself up to more pressure or judgment. I hit send and felt okay about it, not guilty or angry, just neutral. When my parents called to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner, I asked directly if Rachel, Helen, and Uncle Tom would be there because I needed to know before I agreed to come. My mother didn't hesitate or try to dodge the question, which I appreciated. She told me they were having separate celebrations this year to avoid tension, that she and my dad were hosting one group while Helen was hosting another on a different day. She said it honestly and didn't try to make me feel bad about being the reason for the split, didn't suggest I should just get over it so the family could be together. I thanked her for being upfront about it and for being willing to accommodate everyone's needs, even though it meant more work and planning. It felt good to have a parent who respected my boundaries enough to create space for them instead of expecting me to shrink myself to make others comfortable. Thanksgiving at my parents' house was relaxed in a way family gatherings hadn't been in months. The people there were the ones who'd either supported me from the beginning or had come around to understanding why I'd refused to give up my house. Nobody mentioned Rachel or the whole disaster. Nobody made pointed comments about forgiveness or family unity. Several relatives asked about my house and complimented the improvements I'd been making, treating it as obviously mine, without any question or resentment. My dad's brother talked about the new deck I'd built in my backyard. My cousin asked about my plans for the kitchen remodel, and everyone acted like my home ownership was normal and deserved, instead of something I should feel guilty about. We ate turkey and stuffing and pie, told stories, laughed at old family jokes, and it felt genuinely good to be there, sitting at my parents' dining room table with a plate of food and people who actually respected me. I realized something had shifted inside me. I'd stopped feeling guilty about Rachel's broken engagement and the family tensions that had resulted from me refusing to be exploited. The people who mattered had either stood by me from the start or had eventually come around to seeing the situation clearly. The ones who hadn't, who still thought I should have sacrificed my home to keep family peace, weren't relationships worth maintaining at the cost of my self-respect and financial security. I'd Spent months carrying this weight of wondering if I'd done the right thing, if I'd been too harsh, if I should have handled it differently. But sitting there on Thanksgiving, I felt completely certain that I'd made the only choice I could have made without betraying myself. 6 months after the confrontation, at the wedding planning party, my boss called me into her office and told me I was getting promoted to senior manager with a significant raise. I'd been working toward this promotion for over a year, putting in extra hours and taking on additional projects, and having it finally happen felt like validation that my professional life was thriving even while my family life had been a disaster. I celebrated by starting renovations on my home office, the room Rachel had wanted to turn into a nursery for children she didn't even have yet. I hired a contractor to build custom bookshelves along one wall, bought a new desk that fit perfectly under the window, and painted the walls a deep blue that I'd always wanted, but hadn't gotten around to doing. Every time I walked into that room and saw my books organized on the new shelves and my work materials spread across the desk, I felt powerful in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else. I'd reclaimed that space for my own goals and my own life, turning what Rachel had tried to take into something that belonged completely to me. My mother came over to see the finished office renovation and walked around the room, touching the bookshelves and admiring the paint color. She stood in the doorway for a minute, just looking at everything before mentioning casually that Helen had asked how I was doing, which might be a small step toward eventual reconciliation. I told my mother I was open to civil relations with Helen, but wouldn't pretend the house situation hadn't revealed serious family dysfunction that Helen had actively participated in. I said I could be polite at family events and exchange occasional emails, but I wasn't interested in pretending we were close or that what happened was just a misunderstanding everyone could move past. My mother nodded and said she understood, that she'd tell Helen I was doing well and leave it at that. I attended a family wedding for a different cousin, one of the younger ones from my dad's side, who just graduated college. Rachel wasn't there, which didn't surprise me since she'd moved away and probably wasn't coming back for family events anytime soon, but Helen was there sitting with Uncle Tom at a table near the back of the reception hall. We made eye contact when I walked in, and I walked over to their table to say hello because ignoring them would have been awkward and obvious. Helen stood up and we exchanged polite greetings, asked basic questions about how each other was doing, and didn't mention anything about Rachel or houses or the disaster that had split our family. It felt like the right amount of contact, civil but distant, acknowledging each other's existence without pretending to be close. Uncle Tom actually complimented my dress, saying the color looked nice on me, which might have been his way of extending an olive branch without having to apologize directly for pressuring me to give up my home. I thanked him and moved on to find my assigned table, feeling okay about the brief interaction, neither upset nor particularly warm about it. My cousin, Emma, who's 23 and just started her first real job, found me by the dessert table during the reception. She asked if I had any advice about saving for a house because she wanted to start early, like I did. I told her to open a separate savings account that she never touched and to automate transfers from every paycheck so she wouldn't even see the money. Her friend Sarah joined us and asked about down payment percentages and closing costs, treating me like someone who'd figured something important out instead of someone who should have given everything away. I spent 20 minutes talking them through interest rates and property taxes and inspection costs, feeling useful in a way that had nothing to do with sacrifice. Emma said she wanted to own something of her own by the time she was 30, that watching me keep my house showed her it was possible to stand up for yourself even when everyone pressured you to do something else. Sarah nodded and said her parents kept telling her to just rent forever, because buying was too hard, but seeing me made her think differently. I realized the younger cousins weren't looking at me as selfish. They saw my boundaries as strength, as proof that you could protect what you worked for without apologizing. 2 more cousins came over, asking questions about mortgage, pre-approval, and credit scores, and I felt genuinely happy sharing what I'd learned instead of defending my right to keep it. My dad found me alone near the parking lot after most guests had left. He put his hand on my shoulder and said he was proud of how I handled everything with Rachel and the house. His voice was quiet but firm when he told me that standing up to family pressure was braver than anything he'd managed at my age. He admitted he should have spoken up at Thanksgiving instead of staying silent, that his silence made things harder for me when I needed support. I felt my throat get tight because his respect meant everything to me, more than I'd realized until he said it out loud. He explained that watching me refuse to back down taught him something about the difference between keeping peace and enabling bad behavior. My dad said he'd spent too many years avoiding conflict by staying quiet, letting other people push boundaries because speaking up felt uncomfortable. He told me that gaining his open support was worth the temporary family chaos, that he'd rather have an honest relationship with me than a fake peaceful one built on me sacrificing myself. We stood there for a few minutes, not saying anything, just being okay with each other in a way we hadn't been since this whole thing started. When we walked back toward the reception hall, I felt lighter knowing my dad finally understood why I couldn't give up my house just to make other people comfortable. 7 months after the confrontation at the wedding planning party, I woke up in my house on a Saturday morning feeling completely at peace. The drama had faded into something that happened rather than something still happening, and my life had settled into a routine that felt right. I'd kept relationships with family members who respected boundaries, people like my dad and my cousin Emma, who understood that protecting yourself wasn't selfish. I'd established distance from Aunt Helen and Uncle Tom, seeing them at big family events, but not pretending we were close or that everything was fine between us. Rachel was still living in another state, and I heard updates through my mother sometimes, but didn't ask for details. I'd learned that protecting myself wasn't something to feel guilty about, that choosing my own well-being over family pressure was actually the healthiest thing I could have done. Some relationships were damaged permanently, and that was okay, because keeping them would have required me to accept being exploited. I made coffee in my kitchen, the same kitchen Rachel had tried to claim as hers, and felt grateful for every decision that led to me still being here. The house was quiet and completely mine, filled with my furniture and my choices and my life that I'd built without anyone's permission. I sat down in my renovated office with my laptop, ready to work on a project I actually cared about. The custom bookshelves held my books. The desk under the window was covered with my materials, and the deep blue walls reflected light in a way that made me happy every time I walked in. This was the room Rachel wanted to turn into a nursery for children she didn't even have, and instead it became the space where I did my best work. I'd saved for a decade to buy this house, worked overtime and skipped vacations and made sacrifices that Rachel never understood or appreciated. Rachel's attempt to take my home taught me that I was strong enough to stand alone if necessary, that I could survive family rejection and social pressure without crumbling, but I was grateful I didn't have to stand completely alone, that the people who truly mattered stood with me when it counted. My dad supported me, my mother eventually understood, and the younger cousin saw me as someone worth learning from instead of someone who should share everything. I felt genuinely happy and secure sitting in my house, working on something I loved, living a life I'd chosen and defended the fight to keep. My home showed me who I really was, Someone who wouldn't sacrifice herself just to keep other people comfortable. And I liked that person.